Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we have Julie Zebrak with us today, and we're super excited to talk about all things election. So today it's November 1st, and we have 4 days until the general election. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Julie for carving out the time to speak with us, and also for all the work you're doing in Georgia to get out the vote. So in light of that, we're going to keep this brief but informative, and jump into the bio. Julie spent 18 years at the Department of Justice, including as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Deputy Attorney General, before joining the U.S. Department of the Treasury as Senior Advisor to the Deputy Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. In 2016, Julie left the federal government to focus on political consulting and organizing. She was the founder of Moms for HRC and co-founder of Mamas for Kamala and Joe Mamas, where she leverages her expertise in the federal government, policymaking, and politics to organize moms around the country in support of Democrats. So thank you again, Julie, for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Maida.
So we're going to jump into the first question, which is about politics, activism, and organizing. So as I mentioned earlier, you founded Moms for HRC in 2016 and co-founded Mamas for Kamala in 2019. Today, we are only 4 days from the 2024 election, though millions have already voted early. For our listeners, could you please tell us why you founded these organizations and what roles they're playing in the 2024 election?
Yeah, well, so thanks so much for having me. So I was a lawyer in the federal government for 19 years. And when Hillary Clinton became the nominee in 2016, I told my family that I wanted to stop working in the government because when you work in the government, you can't do campaign work. And I wanted to help elect Hillary. So in 2016, I formed a national grassroots organization called Moms for HRC. And the idea behind it was to teach moms like myself who had never done political work how to get involved politically to help elect what then I had hoped to be the first woman president, and how to do it with their busy schedules and competing demands of work, having kids, and ways to participate in the political process, even with having kids. And so that was something that I worked on for 6 months in 2016, and sadly, of course, did not elect the first woman president. But fast forward in 2019, co-founded Mamas for Kamala very early in 2019 during Kamala Harris's primary, and basically taking those same themes of teaching moms how to get involved in elections and sort of demystifying what it means to be political and get politically active, and sort of breaking down into small bite-sized pieces how to get involved in elections and how to do so with your kids or making it fun for kids and that sort of thing. And so I should mention that we were Mamas for Kamala in 2019, but of course, when Joe Biden became the nominee, we temporarily for 4 years changed our name to Joe Mamas. And now we are back to Mamas for Kamala. And so as you can imagine, if you do the math, I have been waiting for 5 years since 2019 to help Kamala become president of the United States. And so as much as I appreciated President Biden's presidency and his courageous decision to step down, I am, of course, over the moon, having been an OG Kamala supporter for 5 years, that now my time and attention is going towards electing the vice president.
And speaking of electing the vice president and getting involved in all this buildup that we've had, as you mentioned, for the past 5 years, I'd love to talk about your work in Georgia, one of the 7 pivotal swing states, especially following the controversies and scrutiny it received following the 2020 election. What drew you to Kamala Harris, especially in 2019, when there was a crowded field for the Democratic presidential nomination? And how have you seen her evolve as a VP and now a presidential candidate?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I first started paying attention to Kamala Harris when she was running for the US Senate. And as I mentioned, I had spent my career at the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice lawyers are mostly, or at least the ones I worked with, prosecutors. And I am not a prosecutor, but my closest friends were prosecutors. And what I loved about working with them is their vision and motivation to ensure that justice is brought to bear. And so what caught my eye about Vice President, then Senator Harris, was that she also had been a prosecutor, had been a district attorney, and then ran and won Attorney General of her state. And, in listening to her speak, she sort of brought to her approach a very similar vibe that I had really admired in the prosecutors that I would work with for almost 20 years, which is wanting to do right, wanting to do justice, believing in the rule of law, believing in accountability. And I really liked that aspect of her. But aside from that, I really also found her to be an incredibly warm and authentic woman. And so what I mean by that, and it's a little hard to describe, but basically when you would talk to her, like if you're, at an event or she's talking to you, and she does try to do this now, even on the rope lines, which is really hard, is that she will look you in the eye, no matter what else is going on around you, around her in the room. She will grab your hand, she'll grab your arm, and she will talk to you as though you are the only person in the room and really listen and pay attention. And I found that so incredibly just rare, and it's so authentic that she was both this fighter for justice, but that she also had this side to her that was just caring and very personal. And I really admired it. Of course, I also really admired her policies and the focus she had made in the Senate on issues like combating anti-Semitism, fighting to reduce maternal mortality rates, looking out for women's health. And, as she developed her platform in her 2019 run, she focused on so many of the issues as a woman that I really care about. And, one of the things she is, I would say in 2024 made an effort not to sort of focus on the fact that she is a woman and she's running to be the first woman president. I think she has downplayed that aspect of her, probably upon the advice of Secretary Clinton. But what I have found so interesting about her policy focus back in 2019, which has continued, is that she really looks at issues that impact women and families. And that's what's very different in watching closely what a female candidate for office, what their top issues are, as opposed to what men's top issues are. And it obviously doesn't mean that like a male candidate doesn't care about women's reproductive health, but he may not center women's reproductive health. He may care about the concept of paid leave, or he may care about the idea that like people in the sandwich generation, which are, women kind of like my age who are have children, but also have older family members that they may or may not need to care for. Men may talk about like they may realize those are real issues for American families, but women are the ones who really find themselves being directly impacted by issues like paid family leave, having to care for elders as well as children, worrying about whether she can get the appropriate health care if her pregnancy has complications, and frankly, worrying about whether the government is going to be spending money and time and research focused on women's health in the future, like really centering women. And so I think, what's different for me in looking at Kamala Harris and to a certain extent Hillary Clinton, as opposed to other candidates that I've supported, is that she sees women and girls and families, and she sees the real life struggles that we deal with, and she is committed to focusing on them and focusing on them in a real meaningful way, that will make people's lives better. And so that to me has been, a really nice part of watching her progress, is that those issues have become more and more central, and certainly are for her campaign now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I especially love what you said about her kind of duality of being both a fighter and then being gracious and caring with people that she's met. I think that's a quality that needs to be, I guess, more common in politicians.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then leading into the advice aspect of it, and as you also mentioned, like being a mother yourself and kind of adding on to conflict duality, many of our listeners are young women in high school or college and are thinking about how to make an impact through their careers, whether in the law, politics, a nonprofit, advocacy, to name a few, or maybe some combination of all these areas. So since you're both a mom, but someone who has been able to create a large, influential platform to share advice and perspective, could you please share your advice on a couple of things? So like first, like the factors to consider, then second, lessons which you've learned along the way, and third, areas in law or policy where you think women need to play a greater role.
Yeah. So I might need you to repeat the questions.
Yeah,
Just
that was a
I'm
lot.
tired. So look, I mean, I'm going to say something that I'm sure your listeners and you have heard before. But I think it's really important to realize that there's not one straight path for building your career. So I'm a mom of two young adult daughters. I worked full time until they were born. Then I worked part-time for probably 12 years. Then I worked full-time again. Then I worked part-time. And then I decided and was fortunate enough to stay home. And so part of why I was able to do that and have that flexibility, I mean, in part was that I have a husband and a partner who also works, but coming, sort of thinking about it through the advice lens, early on in my career as a lawyer, I really chose a path. I was an employment lawyer. I've been an employment lawyer, which means, and I represent management. And that basically means that I help managers manage their staff and, their personnel problems. And I help them figure out how to make their offices, their businesses, their agencies run better with respect to the people that work for them and how they motivate people and how they discipline people and that kind of thing. Part of why I picked that, to be honest, was that I felt like it was a really marketable area of the law that I could do in the government and in the private sector. And so thinking about what's interesting to you and thinking about how marketable it is, I think are two sort of initial questions. And so for me, what allowed me to really succeed in having a full-time schedule and a part-time schedule is that number one, my role was essential to my employer at the Department of Justice. And number two, I was very competent and made myself kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like you couldn't, indispensable. Thank you. Okay, sorry. This is the end of the day.
No, I hear
Anyways,
you.
I made yeah. So I made myself indispensable in terms of I didn't just do my job. I, took initiative and asked to do other work that maybe other people didn't do, but that I thought was interesting. I wasn't afraid to take on work that always isn't the most sexy, but needs to get done because it allowed me to figure out how my organization worked and basically, pardon my French, how to get shit done. And no matter where you are, no matter what level you're working at in any career, it's really good to know how to get shit done. And so I didn't just say, well, this is my job and this is my job description and this is all I'm doing. I expanded my, let's say, portfolio of what I worked on and kept asking for more and asked for more even on areas that maybe weren't traditionally in my portfolio. And so it made me indispensable. And I will say that every job I had in the government, I was asked to apply for. And so what that meant was that people saw my performance, saw how good I was at my job, and then would basically say, well, I have this job over here that I need help with. Will you apply for it? And so it was almost like, I, even though I had to, of course, apply for jobs, it meant that I was already impressing people before I even had applied, and they were saying to me, "Can you come apply for my opening?" So part of my advice is just making sure that you're not just doing your job, but that you're taking on other things that you can handle, and making yourself indispensable. And if you can do that in an area, a career, an area where you know that you're not sort of beholden to one employer for the rest of your life, or one very narrow topic for the rest of your life, I think that sort of marketability always provides reassurance and like job security. They're like, okay, well, if I don't like this anymore, I'll go take this knowledge that I have and bring it somewhere else. So that would be sort of my advice on that career path to begin with. And then, sorry, what was the next question?
Lessons you've learned along the way, and then specific like areas in law or policy where you think women
Yeah,
play a greater role.
right. Well, I kind of shared some of those lessons along the way.
Mhm.
But in terms of like making yourself indispensable and taking things on that maybe not everybody else wants to do,
Right.
some other lessons I've learned along the way. And one of the things I used to do at DOJ was I would recruit and then hire young attorneys. And so one of the lessons that I would always share with young attorneys, but this applies to everybody, is to always be respectful of the staff that is supporting your boss, or the people that you work with. And that's really important, especially in a city like Washington, where a lot of people think that they're really smart and really accomplished. It's important to realize like that the very important person you're going to go meet with has an assistant who is their gatekeeper at their door. And if you're rude to that gatekeeper, or acts naughty to that gatekeeper, the very important person that you're going to meet is going to hear about how obnoxious you are. And so it's always important to be respectful, because the people who work around your boss are important to your boss and important to the functioning of where you work. And so always remember that you are not better than anybody else. And so I think that's a really important piece of advice. And then the other thing I would say is that it's okay to change your mind about what you like. And so for me, after practicing for almost 25 years in total, I guess, I really wanted to get involved in politics. And I was very lucky financially that I was able to step out of the role I was in and follow up on something that I was really passionate about that I came to late. I mean, I would say most people get involved in politics at your age, Mina, and do it when they're young. I kind of did it backwards. I fell in love, had this growing love of political work, and really started doing it in 2016, when my kids were still in high school. Now they're in college and out of college, and I'm still doing it, and I love it. And it is, something that I can do 365 days a year, even on the worst days where I'm, not, hating on Donald Trump or whatever. I'm still really excited to be doing this work. And I really feel like I'm making an impact. And so, that's something for me that's always been really important. I worked very briefly at a law firm right out of law school, and then quickly went to the government. And, for me, having a mission that's bigger than me, that impacts others, that makes others' lives better, that makes our country better, has always been a driving force, and has always kept me interested in what I'm doing. And so whether that was at DOJ or at Treasury, or whether it's now doing political work, I have, discovered pretty early on in my life that that for me, working on something that for the greater good that's bigger than myself was really central to my professional happiness. So, I would just think about that, like what makes you happy. I will say, and I'm going to get to the question about areas where women might want to explore that are a little less traditional, but I think it's really important to, I remember when I was going to law school when I was younger, and a lot of people would make, snarky remarks about, why do you want to go to law school? I hate being a lawyer. And, they would say things like that. And I never bought into that theory. I believe that you make your own happiness in your career. And while work is work, and we can't pretend that it's not, if you are able to pursue a professional career, go to grad school or work in an area, that is not necessarily in the service industry or, in physical labor, that kind of thing, but a professional career that comes with, being focused on, your mind and having, that kind of work. I think that, my, I think, I guess what to me is just really important is recognizing that you can do things that make you happy, even if your first job or your second job doesn't feel that way. You can look for another job and you can find something that makes you happy. And so when I hear of lawyers complaining about their jobs, my attitude is, well, then find another job. Like, find something that makes you happy. And I've been able to do that. I think my husband is a lawyer who's a copyright litigation lawyer. He's been able to do that. And so I would never settle for having a career that doesn't make me happy. And I don't think anybody else should. So then coming back to the area of like women getting involved in certain areas. I mean, I am probably closer to your dad's age. I would say that I was taught from a young age as a young woman that I needed to, like, my dad was very firm and probably a little ahead of his time in that I needed to identify a career where I could then support myself financially so that I was never dependent on a man. And so, being a lawyer met that criteria. But back then, when I was thinking about things I was good at or interested in, I immediately was like, well, I'm not good with math, so I can't go to business school. And now when I think about it, I'm like, I probably would have loved business school because there were aspects of it about like management of people that I ended up doing through the legal direction. But like, I probably would have liked learning about that in business school. Like that would have been something. And so, I knew back then I didn't want to be a doctor because I didn't like blood, and I still stick by that decision. So, I think part of it is don't sell yourself short for any women. You shouldn't sell yourself short on what you'd be good at or what you're interested in. Explore some of the things you're interested in. And so that's where I would say, one of the things I've seen in Washington, well, two things I've seen. There's definitely more male prosecutors, at least in the Washington area, and I suspect around the country. I think women tend to self-select out of that career choice, but I think that women, including our vice president, are, well positioned to be in those, to be doing prosecution work or criminal defense work. And I think women tend to shy away from that career because it involves criminal behavior and that feels yucky. And, but I think that we should have more women in those roles, when it comes to the law, because they bring different perspectives and might be able to, especially as we try to think about the criminal justice system evolving, and becoming more humane and more focused on, um, prosecuting crimes that are serious crimes as opposed to like low level nonviolent, drug crimes, that kind of thing. I just think I think having women in those roles is really important. And I've noticed over the years, there's just not as many women in those roles. And then the other thing I would say is, and this is a very Washington thing again, but I think having more women in the national security space is really important, because, you know, as a general rule, women have a lot of emotional intelligence, and being able to work in the national security space and understand, how things fit together and recognize dangers and being able to flag dangers and flag issues and stuff. I think women are really well positioned to do. And I think that to the extent that young women that are listening to the podcast have an interest in cyber or national security or intelligence and those types of areas, I would encourage, even though it's a little sort of harder to get the scoop on what those jobs are, because they're a little bit more, closed off. There's not a huge job description for doing that work because of the secret nature of it. I think it's really important areas for women to be involved in the law. And I think we're uniquely positioned to do that kind of work and to make ourselves indispensable in those roles. And I'm not necessarily saying go work in the CIA and work in the field in a foreign country. I mean, that's cool too. But even in Washington, being behind the scenes and having that kind of visibility and understanding of what's happening with, foreign actors, with our allies, and with our enemies is a really important role to have. And to have women in those rooms, having those conversations and making those decisions is really important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that part about exploration that you talked about, that can feel a little bit scary. I feel like even to me sometimes, like if you don't have it all figured out or kind of know what path you want to be on, it's like free falling a little bit. Like
Yeah,
I heard what you said on the math thing and the business school thing, and that's kind of I agree with you 1,000%. But then hearing you say that kind of makes me reevaluate whether, that would actually be a good skill and tool to have. Um,
right,
and then
right.
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I will tell you an anecdote about like where I thought I'd be and where I am. And it does kind of tie together, which is, when I applied to college, I went to Tufts for college, and then I went to GW for law school. But when I applied to Tufts for college, I wrote my essay about how I wanted to open a daycare center.
Mm.
And I was back then there was a major called child study, which
Mhm.
was about, you could take it in the path of being a social worker or a teacher or a child psychologist, or I guess I could have opened a daycare center. But I very quickly learned, in that major, is as much as I thought it was interesting, I realized that I didn't want to be a teacher or open a daycare center or be a psychologist or anything like that. I wanted to get into child advocacy work. And so I applied to law school thinking that I was going to come to Washington and work for something called the Children's Defense Fund, which I had only learned about because of Hillary Clinton well before even Bill Clinton was president, but I had followed her and it was something she had done. Anyway, so I thought it was going to be really cool. I was going to be a child advocate when I went to law school. I found out pretty quickly that those jobs are really rare. Like a nonprofit doesn't hire
Mhm.
that many people. So I didn't even get a response to my application when I applied during law school. And I ended up, as I mentioned earlier, going into the private sector and then going into the government. But what is so funny now is that being in politics, and especially Democratic politics, I feel like I am doing child advocacy finally, because I'm working on the issues that affect children and families, and I'm supporting the candidates that have the backs of children and their moms, so that children can have a better life, so that they have access to what they need, so that they, you know, have the education that they need and the food that they need, and, all of that. And so I realized that even though I got through this a very circuitous way, I'm actually finally doing child advocacy work, which is what I had set out to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a great message to say that you kind of, I guess, if you follow your passion, you'll end up in the right place. Um,
Yeah,
and especially tying that back to what you said earlier about that sentiment of like being part of a mission that's bigger than you, um,
yeah,
can really keep you involved in public, private sector, or whatever, makes you happy.
right,
Um,
right.
so yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the advice you've given, for all those questions, and most importantly, for all of the work you're doing in Georgia. I really appreciate all your time.
Yeah, I'm so glad we got to catch up, and I'm so glad to be in Georgia. And I hope the next time we speak on your podcast, we will talking about how we won this election and how we won Georgia specifically.
I hope so too. So thank you so much.
All right, take care. Thank you.